Chapter 20. A couple days later, Mark and Becky made their way up to the 7th floor. "Maybe we should do it some other time," Holly said uncertainly. "Now is the perfect time," reassured Becky. "It's right after breakfast on a Sunday morning and few people are about." "But I've so many other things to do now," protested Holly. Becky and Mark had been interested to learn other students were taking alchemy besides those in the Aura class. Mark wasn't surprised, though. He had done some research on alchemy since Holly first started dueling practice. But when Becky learned there were students out there practicing alchemy who weren't taking the class, she immediately insisted she and Mark escort Holly to Professor Lovegood's office to see if Holly could borrow a book on the subject. Professor Lovegood was deeply immersed in a wizard crossword puzzle. The clues kept changing, as did the number of squares for letters, until an actual word was filled in. Professor Lovegood listened to Holly's concern. With one hand she used a quill to fill out a word and used the other to point her wand towards one of the closed cupboards. A door swung open. "Accio," said Professor Lovegood calmly, while writing another word. Out flew a very thick book. It landed on Professor Lovegood's desk, and she motioned with her quill for Holly to take it. Holly picked up the book. It was labeled Alchemy for Beginners and looked most intimidating. That's why Holly said she had so many other things to do. The prospect of reading that book was daunting. Holly had already thumbed through it, and the book was filled with tiny cursive writing that was difficult to decipher. Reading the first few pages had already put her to sleep. "Are you sure this is going to work?" she asked anxiously. "No," replied Mark. "Remember, Professor Longbottom said he hadn't been there since before the Battle of Hogwarts and didn't know if the room was still there. Even if you don't use it for a while," he added, "isn't it better to know for sure now?" Acting on Roland's suggestion, Holly had asked Professor Lovegood about selective blocking. It hadn't even looked as if Professor Lovegood was listening. She kept on writing words in the puzzle while Holly spoke. But while writing in a letter, Professor Lovegood suggested that Holly might try talking to Professor Longbottom about the Room of Requirement. "You might find something useful there," she said vaguely in her sing-song voice, dismissing them with a nod. That sent the trio to herbology to find Professor Longbottom. Professor Longbottom was in the greenhouse repotting another batch of mandrakes. As mandrakes were an essential part of most antidotes, the whole student body had been using great quantities of it for the potion-making competition. Several batches of mandrake had already been used up in student potion brewing efforts, and the school supplies were running low again. When the three arrived, Professor Longbottom promptly handed each a set of earmuffs, refusing to listen to them until all the plants were repotted. Holly hadn't liked repotting mandrakes the first time when she'd done it during the fall, and this time was no better. The tufty little plants struggled and squirmed every inch of the way from one pot to the other, screaming lustily the whole time. As before, Holly was left sweaty, aching, and covered in earth. Her ears ached even though she'd worn the earmuffs. Only while they were cleaning up would Professor Longbottom listen to Holly's desire to find the Room of Requirement. Then he had insisted Holly specifically describe why she needed the room. "It sounds to me," he said when Holly finished, "that you can practice the selective blocking anywhere. What you need is a space where you can learn about selective blocking." "Well, yeah," replied Holly, "but they kind of go together, don't they? I mean, I can't practice selective blocking until I learn how to do it." "Not necessarily," replied Professor Longbottom, writing something on a scrap of paper. "When using the Room of Requirements, it's best if you know exactly what you need." Professor Longbottom finished his writing. "Here," he said, folding the paper and handing it to Holly. "Go to the 7th floor, he instructed, and think this while walking 3 times, maybe more now, past the blank wall, and if the room is still there, a door will appear." Professor Longbottom explained in more detail about the location of the room, but could not answer any of the students' questions concerning what exactly they would find within the room, should it appear. "This must be it," said Becky excitedly. "See, that's the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy being clubbed by trolls Professor Longbottom talked about. So it must be the blank wall on the other side. Have you got the note?" she inquired anxiously. "Yes," said Holly, "it's right here." She drew out the note she had received from Professor Longbottom. Holly had its contents memorized, having read it numerous times, but she unfolded and read the note again, just in case. Then she stationed herself at one end of the corridor and looked again at her note. "Ready?" asked Mark. "I guess," she said nervously. She started to walk down the corridor, thinking, "I need a place where I can learn how to selectively block. I need a place where I can learn how to selectively block. I need a place—" Holly stole a glance at the blank wall across from the tapestry as she walked. Nothing. When she reached the end of the corridor, Holly turned around and paced the floors again. By the third time she paced the corridors, Holly was ready to give up. This was a silly idea anyway. How could a room help her learn anything? But Becky wouldn't let her quit. "Come on," she encouraged. "You've got to keep trying. Remember, he said you may have to walk more than 3 times. And you've got to really, really need it," added Mark. "Don't just say the words, really mean them, or I don't think it'll work." So Holly redoubled her efforts and tried to concentrate on her need to learn selective blocking. She had to protect herself from dark wizards. She had to be able to tell them apart from other wizards. This was really important. Back and forth Holly paced. She stopped looking at the wall for doors to appear and quit counting the time she turned around, lost in her need. "Look," said Becky suddenly, interrupting Holly's thoughts. Holly stopped and looked at the wall. It was no longer blank. There was a door, a small, plain wooden door with no ornamentation or decoration. The 3 of them gathered around the door and stared. The door was blackened and scorched. It smelled of burnt wood. "Well," said Mark, "it's definitely a door." Professor Longbottom said a door would appear. This must be it. Are you going to open it? Holly reached her hand out and hesitantly touched the blackened handle. The door swung slowly open, creaking as it hung precariously on its blackened, burnt hinges. The 3 students walked inside. "An organ?" wondered Holly aloud. The room of requirement was very small indeed. All it contained was a single lit candelabra sitting upon the edge of an ancient-looking pipe organ, which also smelled of scorched wood. "I don't know how to play an organ," she protested. "What am I supposed to do with an organ?" "I don't know," said Becky, stepping forward and placing her hand gently on the organ's blackened top and then running her fingers on the sooty ivory keys. "Maybe you're supposed to learn how to play an organ," she said, dusting off her blackened fingers. There was a slender book with singed edges sitting on the organ bench. Mark picked it up and read its title. "Look," he said, handing the book to Holly. Holly looked at the book. Its title read, "Organ Basics for Beginners." "You were thinking about learning how to selectively block, weren't you?" "Of course I was," replied Holly angrily. "Why would I be thinking about organs?" "No reason I can think of except," he added thoughtfully, "maybe learning to play an organ will help you learn how to selectively block." "How would that help?" "I have no idea," said Mark slowly. "We don't know anything about how to train an empath, but remember, music helped you when you were first learning how to deal with your abilities." "That's right," agreed Becky eagerly. "You had to hum. Maybe music is the key to learning how to selectively block, too." Holly sighed while sinking into a scorched, puffy chair that hadn't been there but a few seconds earlier. "At least this is something I can write home and tell Mum and Dad about. Mum always wanted me to learn music." She opened the organ book and began to read. It took quite a few visits to the room of requirement to get the organ working properly. After studying the organ book on the first day, Holly got out all the stops and pressed all the right buttons and pushed her first key. But no sound came out. They couldn't figure out why, and when Mark idly wished he knew what was wrong, a book on organ repair materialized on the bench. That's when they discovered not only the outside of the organ had been damaged by fire, but the insides as well. After several days of research, the trio was back in the room of requirement to try to fix the organ. Rose Weasley spotted Holly in the library with the book on fire damage and recommended a couple of fire repair spells that they were able to utilize as well. Finally, the organ pieces were repaired and the organ was placed again in working order. As soon as Holly played her first note, the tiny room reverberated loudly with sound. Instantly, 3 fuzzy earmuffs appeared, which were promptly put to good use. "It says here," commented Holly as she reread her organ book, "that I'm supposed to practice every day if I want to be any good." "Of course," said Becky without concern. She was sitting in one of the two scorched chairs now in the room besides the organ. Mark sat in the other. They were relaxing after their successful repair of the organ. That's the way it always is. My brother Ike is learning the trumpet, and he practices every day. All through the holidays he practiced, Becky sighed. It gave me a headache. He's very, very loud, but he did get better. Well, how am I supposed to practice every day with all the other stuff I have going on? Protested Holly. There's no time. If it's really important, said Mark sternly, you'll make the time. So early the next morning and every morning thereafter, before breakfast, Holly and Becky staggered out of the dorms and over to the room of requirement. Holly was there to practice. Becky came along for company. Sometimes it was Mark that came along, or both. Fortunately, Holly could read notes already because of choir, but she soon learned there was more to playing an organ than reading a few notes. In choir, she was expected to sing, one note at a time. On the organ, both hands were expected to play several different notes at a time, along with both her feet. Of course, Holly found out about the feet part much later. At first, she only worried about how to place and move her fingers on the keys properly. That doesn't look right, said Becky one morning after watching Holly practice her scales. When my choir teacher back at Muggle School used to play the scales, it looked much simpler than that, more graceful. Yeah, well, that's probably because she knew what she was doing, grumbled Holly, wishing she had somebody who could actually play the organ to show her what to do. That's when two elbow-length, smoky gray silk gloves materialized over the keyboard. Holly could see nothing inside them, but the gloves moved as if they were filled with invisible arms and hands. She stared in amazement as the hands positioned themselves above the keys and promptly began to play the scales, showing her the correct fingering position and the proper speed along the way. That's more like it, said Becky, watching approvingly, as if the appearance of disembodied gloves with nothing inside playing an organ were an everyday occurrence. From then on, when Holly had problems with her music, the gloves would appear to show her the proper method. It wasn't quite the same as an actual teacher, but it worked. The terror was absolute. It was all-encompassing and consuming. Holly didn't know why, but she woke with her heart thumping madly, adrenaline flooding her body, convinced she was about to die. And then the sensation was gone. Wide awake, Holly sat up in dark and shivered. Her heart continued to thump wildly. What had just happened? At first, Holly feared she had somehow again been transported to that nightmare world of last year. But no, Sasha was sitting up next to her, also awake. She was purring loudly, sensing Holly's distress. Holly reached out a hand and stroked her cat. The touch calmed them both. Listening carefully, Holly could hear the peaceful breathing of Becky asleep on the bed next to her. Everything seemed normal at Hogwarts, so why had she awakened? Unable to sleep, Holly got up, grabbed a rose, and slipped down to the common room. The fire in the fireplace had burned low, but it was not quite out. Holly settled into a chair and watched the flickering flames while she tried to puzzle out what she had felt, or thought she felt. After a while, Holly realized she was not the only one awake at this early hour. She got up and walked quietly to the house library. She found Roland inside with several open books scattered about. He looked up in surprise at Holly's arrival. "What are you doing up at this hour?" he asked. "It's way past midnight." Holly shrugged. "I couldn't sleep," she said vaguely, unable to explain what she had felt. "And you?" Roland peered at her closely. "Have you been having nightmares again?" he asked with concern. He knew how Holly couldn't sleep, especially at night after her strange disappearance last year. "No, nothing like that," assured Holly. "Something woke me," she explained. "That's all." Roland nodded and relaxed a bit. "And you?" she asked him. "Why are you up?" Roland hesitated. "Just studying," he finally said. "I've a big exam coming up." "Oh?" said Holly. Then she added, "You're frustrated." "No, I'm not," Roland hastily denied. Holly laughed. "Too late," she told him. "You're tired, and I already felt it. No point in denying it. So, why are you so frustrated? Can I help?" Roland sighed and leaned back. "All right," he said finally. "I guess I can talk to you. It's an OR admission exam. We have to study everything and anything dark and try to prepare against anything a dark wizard might plan or do. There's so much out there, I just don't know where to begin." Holly nodded sympathetically. "Your cousin Harry," began Roland again, his voice filled with frustration. "No offense, but he's been there, done it all, and he won't help." "What do you mean?" "I mean," repeated Roland, "he won't help. He won't say a word about anything that has to do with fighting Lord Voldemort, the one person who clearly knows more than anyone else about successfully fighting dark wizards, and he won't talk about it." "It's too painful for him," said Holly softly, remembering what she had felt whenever Cousin Harry mentioned Lord Voldemort's name or talking about those times. "I realize it must be difficult for him," continued Roland bitterly, "and I can understand him not talking to the general public, but he won't talk to the Aurors either. How can we learn from this? How can we prepare ourselves against another dark wizard if we can't learn about the previous ones?" Holly listened to his words helplessly. She knew Cousin Harry never spoke about his experiences to his family, but she never realized he truly never spoke about them to anyone. Surely Roland had a point. Surely the Aurors needed to know what had happened. "You know nothing?" she suggested tentatively. "Oh, bits and pieces," replied Roland dismissively. "A word here, an action there, but not the whole picture. Did you know, for example, that one time Harry Potter was asleep in the dorms when he woke up and claimed Arthur Weasley had been attacked? I heard that from Sean, who heard it from one of the other Gryffindors," he explained. "Harry gave the alert and saved Arthur Weasley's life. Mr. Weasley was in the Ministry of Magic at the time. That's way over in London." How did Harry know? What incredible help it would be today if Aurors could all keep in touch with each other that way. "We could do our jobs much better if we knew exactly what went on the last time," continued Roland passionately. "That way we can prevent it from happening again. But there's so much we don't know. It's like trying to do our job blindfolded." He looked up at Holly, realizing suddenly to whom he was talking. "But none of this is your problem," he told her. "Harry Potter has been that way long before you came to Hogwarts, and I doubt he'll change now." "I need to get some rest," he said abruptly, closing all his books. "You too," he added. "Shall we?" Holly nodded. The feeling of terror had faded into distant memory, and she was feeling sleepy again. Holly watched silently as he stacked his books up neatly. Roland," she said hesitantly. "Yes?" "Maybe it's supposed to be that way," she said tentatively. "What way?" "You not knowing," Holly continued, and quickly tried to explain before Roland could interrupt. "You said yourself I had to be ready for the unexpected and the unknown. If you knew everything Lord Voldemort did, if you knew all there was to know about Cousin Harry and Lord Voldemort, then you wouldn't be looking so hard. You'd become complacent. If there is another dark wizard, it won't be Lord Voldemort, and he'll do things different. Surprise will be his best weapon. With you looking as hard as you have, at anything and everything, a dark wizard will have a difficult time surprising you." Roland didn't respond immediately to Holly's words. He gathered up his books silently and left the library. Holly followed him into the common room. Then they split up, each headed over to the stairs on their respective side of the dorms. Roland stopped at the base of the boys' stairs and looked over at Holly. "Maybe you're right," he said thoughtfully, and Holly could tell that some of the intense frustration she had felt earlier had lessened. "Good night, Holly." "Good night." Becky roused Holly up the usual time in the morning. Bleary-eyed, Holly staggered off to practice organ before breakfast. The events of the early morning seemed more of a dream than reality. School continued on as usual. The next day went much the same, but at dinner, Headmistress McGonagall stood before the group with an announcement. Students would not be permitted to visit Hogsmeade the next day. There was a loud murmuring of disappointment at this. The headmistress went on to explain that there were several groups of Muggles in the area, and it had been decided that the students would be safer remaining at Hogwarts until all the Muggles left. The headmistress was certain that things would be back to normal next week, and students would again be permitted to visit Hogsmeade. "I wonder what that's all about?" asked Holly. She wasn't permitted to visit Hogsmeade yet anyway, so the decision didn't affect her. But some of the older Hufflepuffs had already made shopping plans that had to be canceled, and they were rather disappointed. "I don't know," said Gwen, shaking her short curly black hair. "We haven't heard anything about this. Maybe Professor Iverson knows more." Professor Iverson was the head of the Hufflepuff house. I'll ask her the next time I see her." Gwen was able to add a few more details when everyone gathered for the weekly house meeting that evening. "There are searchers," she told the group. "Several wizards have come out to strengthen Hogwarts' anti-Muggle wards, and some obliviators from the Office of Misinformation have joined the Muggles to make sure a stray searcher doesn't somehow wander onto Hogwarts ground by accident. So we have nothing to worry about." "But what are they searching for?" asked Becky. Gwen shook her head. "People, I guess," she answered. "I don't rightly know." "Well, it must be important," said Mark, "or they wouldn't be searching so." "I hope they find what they're searching for soon," commented Hugh. "Me too," agreed the rest of the group. The next day, the morning mail fluttered in at breakfast time, as usual. Some of the owls continued flying about and then left their messages undelivered. Their messages were intended for students who had elected to sleep in. The owls would return again the next day to deliver their messages. Students who suspected they had missed mail would have to go to the owlry if they wanted to receive their mail any sooner. Becky gave a cry of delight when she saw Schuyler flying in. Schuyler landed gracefully next to Becky and held out her leg. Becky removed the message attached. "Hello there," she said affectionately to Schuyler while gently ruffling the white feathers on his neck. Holly handed the owl a tidbit and idly watched the other owls swoop about. Schuyler occasionally brought her messages, too. Becky unfolded the message and read quickly. "Hey," she said with interest. "Mum says that some plane went missing in this area. She's wondering if we've heard anything about it." Holly froze. "When?" she asked, with a sense of unease and disquiet growing within her. Becky read further. "It doesn't say," she replied, "but I bet that's why all the Muggle searchers are out." Becky pulled out her quill and scratched a quick note to her parents on the back. Then she rolled the message up and told Schuyler to fly home. Holly watched the heart-faced owl fly off and abruptly got up from the table. "I've got to know for sure," she muttered to herself. "Know what?" asked Becky, scrambling to get up herself. "Know whether it was a plane," replied Holly as she moved quickly down the aisle to the head tables. Becky hurried behind. "Excuse me," said Holly, looking up at Professor Iverson, "but could I ask you a question?" Professor Iverson had just stood from her place at the table and was preparing to leave. She looked down at Holly and smiled. "Certainly," she replied, coming off the raised area. Professor Iverson's mottled robes blended in perfectly with her long brown hair, especially when the morning sun cast all sorts of highlights on it. "Now," she said, looking at the two with her large brown eyes, "how can I help you?" Professor Iverson was incredibly tall and slender. Holly had to look way up to ask her question. "The Muggle searchers outside," began Holly. "Are they searching for a missing airplane?" "Why, I'm not sure," replied Professor Iverson, puzzled by the question. "I believe something was mentioned about a Muggle air transport, but I could be mistaken." "When did it happen?" questioned Holly. "A day or two ago, I suppose. Why?" "Could it have been in the morning, like really early?" persisted Holly. "Really, really early?" "I couldn't say," replied Professor Iverson. "I really don't know. What's this all about?" "I'm not sure," began Holly uncertainly, "but I felt something the other day that I think is She broke off, and then asked suddenly, "Can the Muggles find what they're looking for if what they're seeking is on school grounds?" Professor Iverson blinked a few times. She began uncertainly. "I think you'd best talk to the headmistress about that." Holly nodded in agreement. "Could I do that?" she asked. "Certainly," replied Professor Iverson. "Come with me," she commanded, and her slender frame moved quickly, leading the way out of the great hall. "You felt something the other day?" questioned Becky as she walked. "Why didn't I know about it?" "It was early in the morning," replied Holly, moving quickly to keep up with Professor Iverson's long stride. "You were asleep. It woke me up and happened so fast that I wasn't sure what had happened at all. I thought it might have been a bad dream, but knowing what I know now, I think it was the plane they were searching for, and the plane passed right over us." "That can't be," protested Becky as they rounded a corner and headed up the stairs. "I know you don't block while you sleep, but your range goes down with the walls and such. You would have had to feel something through the walls of the plane, plus those of Hogwarts, not to mention the distance thing. Planes are usually way up high." "I know," agreed Holly, practically trotting to keep pace with the professor. "That's why I think the plane was flying real low when it passed overhead. Otherwise, I wouldn't have sensed a thing." But they're muggles, insisted Becky while they climbed the stairs. You've always said that muggle emotions were way softer than wizard ones. That's true, agreed Holly, but they were muggles in trouble. If all the muggles were thinking the same thing, I should think that would magnify things, don't you? They were scared, continued Holly, not waiting for Becky to respond. Real scared. I woke up terrified and... Holly stopped, unwilling to express what else she had felt. It's got to be the people on the plane I felt, she said urgently. I just know it. But that doesn't make sense, protested Becky. Planes are loud. If a plane were flying low enough for you to sense the people within, wouldn't someone else have heard it? The walls and ceilings of Hogwarts are thick, replied Holly while mounting the stairs. I can't even hear it when it rains. Besides, everyone was asleep at the time. But neither Professor Hagrid nor Professor Ferenz sleep in the castle, persisted Becky as they got off the stairs and started down another corridor. Surely they would have heard something. They should certainly have heard something, put in Professor Iverson, who had been listening to their conversation with interest. Were they here? But Professor Hagrid and Professor Ferenz both left 4 days ago for a conference in Sweden on magical creatures. That's right, exclaimed Holly. Remember Susan said she would be feeding Fang for a few days? So there was no one outside to notice anything. Susan had followed Cousin Harry's suggestion and gotten Professor Hagrid to take her into the woods with him as an assistant. Besides learning about magical creatures within the woods, Susan was having a grand time finding all sorts of new and different bugs. So far, she hadn't found any like the one Holly had plucked off the banister, but she was still looking. The three came to a stop at the end of the hall in front of a large stone gargoyle. Catnip candy, said Professor Iverson to the gargoyle. Becky gasped as the gargoyle sprang to life. She'd never been to the headmistress's office. Holly had, twice so far, more if one counted the visits she made there with Headmaster Snape. The gargoyle leaped aside and the wall behind it split in two, revealing a stone staircase that moved continuously upward like a spiral escalator. All three stepped onto the moving stairs, and the wall closed behind them with a thud. They moved upward in tightly spiraling circles until they reached the highly polished oak door with a shiny brass knocker shaped like a griffin. Professor Iverson sharply rapped on the door 3 times, and the door opened. They entered an empty circular room with a high ceiling. Wait here, directed Professor Iverson, while I get the headmistress. She walked to the door in the back of the room. Holly had been in the office before, but it was Becky's first time. Becky looked around the room curiously. Holly directed Becky's attention to the portraits on the walls. Some of them were no longer total strangers to Holly. There was a lady with blonde ringlets, whose portrait Holly recognized as also hanging in St. Muggles. Then there was the one of the old man with the white hair and the long white beard that Holly knew now to be that of Headmaster Albus Dumbledore. He greeted Holly and Becky with a smile when they looked at him. Holly smiled back, but her eyes sought the portrait next to it, the one of a much younger man with a sallow skin and dark black hair, hooked nose, and dark beady eyes. Holly smiled a greeting to the portrait of Headmaster Snape. She had fond memories of him, but he only seemed to glare at her. Of course, thought Holly sadly, this Snape does not know me. On a side wall, Holly found another portrait she recognized, Phineas Black. She'd seen and met him at Cousin Harry's house. Phineas gave Holly a quick wink before pretending to be bored and uninterested in their presence. Professor Iverson and Headmistress McGonagall came in from the balcony. The headmistress had been keeping track of the Muggle search and wizard diversion efforts. What's all this about? She asked, looking at the 2 students. Miss Wycliffe believes the item the Muggles are seeking might be located on Hogwarts ground, said Professor Iverson bluntly. Do you? Asked Headmistress McGonagall, adjusting her square-rimmed glasses and peering closely at Holly. Yes, replied Holly, suddenly not so certain. At least I think so. I'm sure I sensed the passengers flying overhead a couple nights ago, and the plane had to be really low in the sky for me to do that. Holly's voice trailed off as she suddenly realized a low-flying plane did not necessarily mean it came down on Hogwarts grounds. Or not, she added lamely, suddenly sorry she had bothered the headmistress. It's probably nothing. Perhaps, agreed the headmistress. However, you have demonstrated excellent instincts in the past. The fact that the Muggles keep on angling in our direction would seem to lend merit to your proposition, she added thoughtfully. Coming to a decision, Headmistress McGonagall straightened and stated, "The possibility of the missing craft might be on Hogwarts ground has not yet been explored, so we need to conduct a search to be certain. Miss Wycliffe," she directed, "get your broom and meet me at the entrance as soon as possible. If the craft is here," she added, "there might be survivors. I'll notify Madame Pomfrey to get her things and join us." The headmistress turned to Professor Iverson and said, "Would you be so good as to find Professor Longbottom and see if he has some bottles of marsh mist we could use? Oh, at least 3 bottles if possible." The headmistress looked down at Holly and noticed a distressed look on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked. Holly's face reddened a bit. I don't have a broom," she confessed. Becky looked at Holly worriedly. Neither did she. What good was a broom when it couldn't be flown at home, and she wouldn't be using it at school? "I know," said Becky excitedly. "Mark has one. I bet he'd lend it to you." Headmistress McGonagall nodded. "Very well, then. See if you can borrow Mr. Owen's broom. We'll all meet at the steps in about 10 minutes. Agreed?" Holly nodded, and everyone left the room. 10 minutes later, more like 15, everyone was gathered at the front steps. Mark stood watching eagerly with Becky while Holly held his broom ready to use. Madame Pomfrey was there with her medical bag, and Professor Iverson handed the headmistress a large knapsack that clinked. A tiny owl resting on his shoulder fluttered off when the headmistress strapped the bag onto her back. The owl hovered above her in the air while she adjusted her sack. Then it fluttered back down, landing on top of the sack. Its talons dug securely into the leather of the sack. "I'd ask you along," said Headmistress McGonagall to Professor Iverson, "but we're taking a big risk as it is, flying at daylight with so many muggles about. We wouldn't be attempting this at all if it weren't for Miss Wycliffe here," she added. "Me?" squeaked Holly in surprise. "Certainly," replied the headmistress. "You can scan the area quickly looking for signs of life, which means we'll be in the air the least amount of time possible. If you don't find anything, then we'll mount a larger land search later at night when we won't have to worry about survivors." "Ready?" she asked, lifting her broom. The headmistress sat gracefully on her broom in a side saddle position and hovered over the ground. "Ready," replied Madame Pomfrey, mounting her own broom with ease, also side saddle fashion. She hovered confidently next to the headmistress. Ready?" replied Holly uncertainly, clumsily getting on Mark's broom the regular way. It had been a while since she last flew. She hoped she didn't do something incredibly dumb like fall off. Soon she was hovering in the air a few meters off the ground with the other 2. "Right," said Headmistress McGonagall. "We fly to the edge of the forest and then rise just above the trees and do a slow spiral outward. Let us know the minute you sense someone strange in the forest," she commanded Holly. "Remember, there are centaurs in the forest, so look for emotions that are in pain or don't belong." Holly nodded, and the 3 flew off towards the forest. Once on the edge, Headmistress McGonagall turned her broom, and the 3 started a slow circle around Hogwarts. "Is this too fast?" she asked Holly as they flew. "No," replied Holly. She had unblocked and was concentrating on finding emotions below. It was fairly easy to ignore the emotions next to her. Madame Pomfrey was a quiet whisperer, and the headmistress, well, Holly couldn't sense her at all. She must be practicing alchemy. Holly didn't watch the surroundings at all. Instead, she kept one eye on the broom ahead of her and followed it while focusing. After they had flown a while, Holly could sense a series of emotions down below. Quiet, calm. These were not the emotions of plain survivors in distress. They must be the emotions of the centaurs the headmistress had mentioned. Flying closer, she felt within them the emotions of Celeste. They were definitely centaurs. Holly ignored the emotions in that direction and looked for emotions elsewhere. The 3 continued to fly. "Anything?" asked Headmistress McGonagall after a while, interrupting Holly's concentration. "No, nothing," replied Holly. She didn't think it worth mentioning the centaurs she had found. "Well, we're nearing the edge of the school grounds, so we'll be turning back pretty soon," said Headmistress McGonagall. Holly nodded absently. She was listening with only half an ear. There was something over there, not quite the way they were traveling. She veered her broom in that direction to get closer. Suddenly Holly felt herself slipping. She lost her grasp on the broom and started falling. Dimly she heard someone shout, "Leve corpus!" before everything went black.